Hello, class. This is how I will host all of our lectures. I will get on first and give you any updates or announcements or reminders, and then I will go off the screen because just having me on the screen is distracting, and I will go through the material we need to cover during that session. So today I want to talk about just in general anatomy and physiology, some of the language, and then an overview of all of the systems, some of which we'll be talking about this semester. So that's what the lecture will be about. Our very first test will be coming up quickly, but it's only about this first chapter. So this is an opportunity to really do well on an exam and get a good grade and give you somewhat of a cushion. I'll remind you that the syllabus quiz is on the 31st. Many of you have taken it. This is extra credit. It can't hurt you if you don't take it, but of course it can help you if you do take it. That is due the 31st. And then the quiz over the material is due on the 7th. And those are really short 10-point quizzes. I think I give 30 minutes to do it. It probably will only take you 15. And then the first exam will be September 9th. If you haven't already gotten in and completed the first day survey, if you look on the content page, there's a tab there that says first day survey. That survey is important because it gives me information about my students and where you are and what you have going on, if there's anything that's going to hinder you in the class. So I know how to best do the things that my students need for success. So please get in there and do that. There's also an introduction discussion board. You don't have to do that, but it would be nice if you did that. And so you can go there and become acquainted with the other students in the class. Just share any information that you'd like to share with us, your major, any hobbies, anything like that. And maybe a picture. And go look at the other ones because we are not connected in a physical way, in class or even on virtual class together. That's a way to become acquainted with your classmates. I think that is all I need to announce right now. If I think of anything else, I will say it at the end. So I'm going to turn my camera off, and then we're going to get into this initial information. And so I'm going to try to talk at a pace that allows you to follow along and fill in any notes that you need to fill in. On the content page, you will see an area that says class notes. That correlates with the lecture. So if I were you, I would pull those up or print those out and follow along. And if there's anything that I say that's not in the notes or needs to be added to the notes, then I would add those things. Okay? So those things are going to be important for the exam. Your notes here that I'm giving and those that are posted together make up the stuff that's most important for the exams. Of course, the anatomy as well. This first chapter doesn't have a whole lot of anatomy in a physical sense with models, but we have some diagrams. You colored some stuff in your coloring book, and we'll look at some diagrams here today as well. So we start off defining anatomy and physiology. And anatomy is essentially how the stuff looks. And physiology is essentially then how that stuff works, right? So if you want a formal definition, anatomy is the study of the structures of the body, the parts, the organs, and their relationship to one another. Sometimes the term morphology is used in relationship to anatomy. So what are the structures? What do they look like? What are the parts? Where is their placement? That's what anatomy is. Then physiology is then how do those structures work? How do those anatomical structures work? What is their responsibility, right? So physiology can be at various levels. We can look at physiology on a molecular level, on a cellular level, tissue, organ, whole animal physiology. So what is the responsibility of those structures that you study. Okay, so we can use the term anatomy separate from physiology, and actually I teach 240, 241. And 240 is anatomy and 241 is physiology, but in truth, you can't really fully pull those things apart, right? You can't really talk about the anatomy and how structures look in their placement without having some idea of what they do. And surely you can't talk about physiology without knowing the anatomy. You got to know the structures where they are, right, before you can even talk about what they do. So, anatomy and physiology are tightly interwoven. If we want to talk about specific areas of anatomy, that can be, excuse me, broken down in a number of ways. So gross anatomy means large, right? Like your check before taxes, right? The stuff that you can see visibly without any aid of magnification. And so when we talk about gross anatomy, and a lot of what we'll be talking about is gross anatomy, we can look at that in a number of different ways, regionally, right? Superficial and internal structures in a certain area of the body. Um, Systematic, right? Where, and I have on here systemic, but probably systematic is the best term. So we talk about each organ system, right? And we're going to use that method. So we'll go from system to system and look at those structures within a system. And then surface anatomy, where we're talking about the surface with anatomical markings. And then other types of or branches or areas of anatomy, microscopic anatomy, where you need the aid of a microscope, right? So if we're talking about on a cellular level, studying the cells, the term for that area is cytology. If we're studying tissues, histology. And then developmental anatomy can also be called embryology. And sometimes those embryology classes are comparative, because actually a lot of organisms look very similar when they start developing and become embryos. They look very similar, and then later on, prior to actual gestation, they start to take on some differences. And pathological or clinical anatomy, looking at the changes in structures, or looking at the changes in the anatomy as a disease progresses. Radiographic anatomy. So, radiographic anatomy is really important, right? Because if you potentially have an issue with your kidneys, you don't want to have to be invasive to determine if there is potentially something wrong. You want to be able to visualize those structures without being invasive. So radiographic anatomy allows us to do that, right? So we use x-rays and MRIs and ultrasound and those kinds of things. Comparative anatomy, I related that to embryology, but comparative anatomy is comparing how different species develop evolutionarily, and it almost always starts with embryology. Okay, so those are just some areas. We could add many more. Let's look at physiology. We already defined that, how things work. Let me go back. Now, there are a number of different branches of physiology, and for whatever reason, I didn't list those here, but I will just name some. You can have cardiovascular physiology, right? You can have neurophysiology. And so those are specific. You can have exercise physiology, which is not necessarily a particular organ system, right? But how then your body responds to physiology. So you can have various branches of physiology as well, right? And so we didn't name any of those, but I wanted to just add some of those too. Okay, so then we want to talk about structural organization. So there are different levels of structural organization, things that make us up as organisms or individuals, and then beyond that, but we can go all the way to ecosystems. We won't go beyond the organism here. So we start at the chemical level. And at the lowest level, we have atoms. So anything that is matter, anything that is a solid, liquid, or a gas, is at minimum an atom, living or non-living. So atoms are the smallest unit of matter, the building blocks of everything, right? That is a solid, a liquid, or a gas, living or not. And so if you look at a chemical periodic table, you'll see all of those chemicals listed. So I have a simple example here: sodium, right? Sodium, oxygen, hydrogen, carbon. You can name a bunch of them, right? One unit of those chemicals is an atom. And then we have molecules. And so molecules are atoms bonded together to give us more of a functional unit. And so the example I have here is sodium chloride, which is a small molecule. Just sodium and chloride makes a small molecule. Molecules can be small like that, or molecules can be huge, like DNA, right? One molecule of DNA would be huge. That's a molecule. Or certain carbohydrates or whatever. So molecules can be small, just a couple of atoms, or they can be large with many, many atoms. And then we go to the cellular level. Now, I can't just say a bunch of molecules together make a cell, right? Because cells are living, and there are a lot of dynamics involved in defining something that is living, and we'll talk about that. But cells are the smallest unit of life, so anything that is living is at least a cell, right? And so we have single cell organisms, things you find in pond water, for example, you may have studied in a general biology class. And then we have cells within us, and cells have different responsibilities. They can vary in size and shape, of course, and function. And we'll get into those cells when we get to that area, some of those different cells. And then similar cells working together form tissue. So the next rung on our ladder is tissue. And so in us, a cell by itself isn't going to do much. You need a collection of cells to work together to form tissue. So tissue is a functional unit. And so later we'll talk about different tissues: muscle tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue. And those will encompass all of the tissues within the body. And then if we have two or more tissues together working to carry out a specific function, we have an organ. So organs are structures with two or more tissue types that are put together in a unit, that organ, to carry out particular functions. And then organ systems, groups of organs that work together, two or more organs that work together to carry out a common purpose. So for example, an organ would be the heart. The organ system would be the cardiovascular system. So we got the heart and the blood vessels working together to create an organ system. And then of course the organism, us as an individual, having all of those organ systems within the body. And here this is cut off. This is the highest level of, it should say, structural organization. So the organism in this particular course is the highest level of, add here, structural organization. And so here this illustration shows us. So here's an atom. Atoms bonded together gives a molecule. Now they've used this term macromolecule. I didn't use that, but this is a large molecule. So this is a simple molecule, and this is a huge molecule. I didn't mention organelles, excuse me, but we'll talk about organelles. These are specific functional structures within the cell, but you don't have to include that on your list. You also don't have to include macromolecule on the list. So I'm going to cross them out, not that they aren't valid, but just that you don't have to list them on the list, right? So the ones you want to list on the list are atom, molecule, cells, then tissue. So a bunch of these cells together create tissue. Now, this is a section out of this organ. This is the organ. And if you look at this, actually, there are a number of different tissues here. There are layers of tissue that make up the organ. And then the organ is within the organ system. This happens to be the digestive system. So we have a number of organs that contribute to making up that system. And this is just one of the systems that is then within the organism. Okay. Now, I said that things that are living, like a cell, is going to have some specific characteristics, right? So the first thing is maintaining boundaries. All living things are going to have something that differentiates their external environment from themselves. So what is the separation of self and non-self, right? So for us, and I'm just going to add some things here, our skin is our boundary. Another name for skin is integument. So for us, our skin provides our boundary. For cells, what would be the boundary? Would be a cell membrane. So our cells have a membrane. Our whole body, the boundary is the skin. So all living things are going to have some boundary. So even if it's a single cell, it's going to have a membrane, right? Movement. Now I have a question. Do all living things move? Do plants move? So I give varied answers on that. Movement doesn't just mean locomotion. Movement also means internal movement. So everything that is living has some sort of movement, right? So if plants can't get up and walk around, and if they start walking around, we're going to be in trouble. But they're moving content inside all the time. Trees are moving water up from the roots and foods down from the leaves, right? If you have a house plant, you can turn it. Usually the leaves are growing towards the window, towards the light, and you turn it around, right? And in a couple days, you'll see those leaves starting to go back towards the window. Now, you can't sit there and watch it, right? Because you'll never see it physically move, but it does. And then plants grow, so there's movement and growth. So all living things move. We, of course, have a very well-developed muscular system that allows us to move, right? So the muscles attached to our bone are called skeletal muscles. Right. So our skeletal muscles allow us to get up and move around, pick up a pencil, manipulate our environment, have facial expression. So we have that kind of movement. And then we have other muscle, smooth muscle and cardiac muscle for internal movement. Right. Movement of stuff through our digestive system, movement of blood through our body, right? So we have other types of muscle that allows for that. Okay. All living things can move at least internally. Responsiveness or irritability. That is our ability to respond to stimuli. Responsiveness or irritability is our ability to respond to stimuli. That can be external or internal, right? So we can detect some kind of changes within or around us. For us, we have a very well-developed nervous system that allows that in us, right? So if you touch something hot, right, you pull your hand away. Our nervous system allows us to do that. When we see something, we can respond. When we hear something, we can respond. That's an extension of the nervous system. We call it special senses. So we have that. So even when I talked about the plant, it responds to the light, right? It moves towards the light. So all living things have some level of responsiveness. Digestion. Digestion is the means by which we break down and use nutrients, right? And of course, we have a very well developed digestive system for that. Now, different organisms utilize nutrients differently, and actually, plants create their own nutrients, right, through photosynthesis. But all living things have some way by which they take in food material or nutrients, break those things down for utilization within the organism or even within the cell. And the whole point of that is for carrying out chemical reactions. So the whole point of us taking in that burger, right, is to break it down and get the molecules out that we need to sustain the life of our cells, to carry out chemical reactions. So metabolism is really the sum of all of the chemical reactions that occur in the body. Metabolism is the chemical reactions that occur in the body. So all living things have chemical reactions going on at all times, right? Excretion, elimination of waste. Elimination of waste. So you know we do that via our digestive system, respiratory system. We breathe off CO2. Urinary system, and then the integument. That's the skin. We sweat, so we get rid of some waste products that way as well. Of course, reproduction. You have to, right, produce offspring. So reproduction can be sexual or asexual. Of course, we understand what sexual reproduction is, right? It requires, um, you know, in us, sperm and eggs, right, to create a new offspring. Asexual reproduction would be our cells. They simply divide to produce new cells. I often ask, well, are plants sexual or asexual? And then I get both answers. And actually, both answers are correct. Plants are sexual as well as asexual. I can come to your house and see a nice plant and say, oh, can I have a piece of that? And then I take it home and root it, and then I have a whole new plant. Some plants actually drop off little, like the spider plant drops off little tiny plants that can root and develop new plants. But plants have flowers. The flowers of plants are the sexual parts. So when you hear people talking about having a discussion about the birds and the bees, and you think, what do birds and bees have to do with sex? They have to do with plant sex. But for us, we have reproductive systems that allow for sexual reproduction. And then growth and differentiation. So when we talk about growing, you can grow in the cells can grow in size, or you can grow in the numbers of cells. So we actually do both. Um, the cell size is already predetermined, and actually the size of the individual is predetermined when we talk about, general body type and height like that. But of course, you can always get bigger with regards to gaining weight, so then you still increase the numbers of cells. And when we talk about differentiation, then those cells will then become specialized, right? So we'll have different cells in our body that have different responsibilities that ultimately make different types of tissue. Okay. So what do we need to maintain life? Now, this list is specific to us. Not all living things need the exact same thing to sustain life. They need a lot of these things, but we need some specific things. So we need an energy source. We need some nutrients, right? We need some kind of food source so that we can get the molecules out in order to carry out chemical reactions that allow us to produce energy. And so, three main types of molecules that we use as nutrient sources: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Carbohydrates mainly come from plant products, and carbohydrates are the type of molecule that lead immediately into the reactions that allow us to produce energy. For us, energy is ATP, and I'm going to make a side note of that. For us, energy is ATP. So essentially, that's the molecule that provides us with energy. So that's a little side note there. And I'll just put a box around it so you know that's a side note. And so carbohydrates go directly into the chemical reactions that allow us to produce ATP. And then we have fats. Fats can come from animal products and plant products. That's the second line for producing energy. And then we have proteins. You have some proteins from plant products. We get the bulk of our proteins from animal products. We typically don't use proteins to make ATP unless we don't have any carbohydrates or fats. We typically use proteins to break them down to get the molecules out to make our own proteins. So we typically use proteins to make our own proteins. We'll use those to produce energy if I don't have any carbs, if I don't have any fats. Okay, so we need nutrients, we need water. We are mainly made of water. Our secretions, excretions, mainly water based. We need a watery environment for the chemical reactions in our body to occur, right? So water is absolutely essential. We need oxygen. Now, oxygen is only about 20% of the air that we breathe in, and that's actually sufficient. The reason why we need oxygen is because those chemical reactions to produce ATP require oxygen. So I often ask my students, why do we need oxygen? And they, oh, to breathe. No, you breathe to get oxygen, but why do you need oxygen, right? The chemical reactions that allow us to produce ATP require oxygen. So that is why we need it. We have internal temperature regulation, right? The reason why we need to have a stable temperature, and our temperature is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, is the chemical reactions that occur in our body do so at an optimal temperature. And so we need to have that stable temperature. And then we have a number of systems in place to help regulate the temperature. We have some checks and balances that help regulate the temperature. And of course, muscle contraction also helps to generate heat. There are a number of things involved in that. And we'll talk about some mechanisms. I think your book tends to give an example of that temperature regulation. Maintenance of atmospheric pressure. We have to stay at atmospheric pressure for adequate ventilation and gas exchange so that we can get the oxygen that we need. So when you go in a plane, for example, they will say the cabin has been pressurized, right? So the cabin has been pressurized to atmospheric pressure. And they tell you if the cabin loses pressure, the masks will drop down, put your mask on first, and then help your neighbor. Even if the bag doesn't inflate, oxygen is moving through the bag. People get on the plane and, people fly a lot and they just tend to not pay attention to what those safety instructions are. I don't care how many times I fly, I still listen to those safety instructions. That idea of putting your mask on first and then helping your neighbor, it is critical. The higher you go, the higher the elevation, the less oxygen there is. So within a minute or couple minutes, the cabin loses pressure and there's no oxygen, you're going to pass out, and then very shortly thereafter you're going to be gone. So put that mask on. If that drops down, put it on, because we have to be at atmospheric pressure to get proper ventilation and gas exchange. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about are the organ systems. Now, I'm going to just give you a brief overview of each of the organ systems that you will cover between 152 and 153. We'll talk about some of the first ones, and then some of the others will be talked about in 153. So this is a general overview, so you should have a general idea of what each system is responsible for and some of the parts. I'm just going to kind of move through this with a little bit of information. If you look in your textbook, there are some diagrams, and then there are little captions under the diagrams or associated with the diagrams that give you a little bit more information. I want you to read those in your textbook. And again, it doesn't matter which textbook you have, they give you a little bit more information that I'm giving here. So I want you to read those. So we talked about the integument, that's the skin. People don't think about that as being an organ. Actually, it's the biggest organ in your body, right? Because it covers the whole surface. The skin, we kind of take for granted. We don't think of it being an organ. We don't think of it being important, but it's super important, right? It protects us, right? We already said it's our boundary, and it protects us from everything outside. It is waterproofing and water conserving, right? So if we sit in the tub, we take a shower, we go get in the pool, right? We don't take on more water. We don't swell up, right? And if we sit in the sun, if we're out hiking, if we're sitting on the beach, we don't dry out like a slug. So it is both waterproofing and water conserving. It can cushions, it protects, right? So the stuff underneath the skin is protected because of the skin. So our skin takes a whole lot of bumps and bruises, right? And it protects the structures underneath. I tell my students about this movie series. I guess the movie series comes from the 80s, and none of you were born at that time. But it's called, what was it called? Oh my goodness. Anyway, I'll think of it. But the movie was about this little puzzle box. And whoever comes in contact with the puzzle box, they already know you're not supposed to touch the puzzle box. Somehow it's made clear that it's like an ancient puzzle box. You're not supposed to touch it. But inevitably, somebody touches it, and then monsters come out. And one of the main monsters is called Skinhead. Well, anyway, this lady, she was messing with the box. I think it's called Hellraisers. That's the name of the movie. She was in Hellraisers 2. And she messed with the box and she got killed, but somehow she was able to come back one area or at a time. So she first came back as a skeleton, and then she got her muscle. The last thing was skin. So she was walking around with this evening gown on, wrapped up in gauze because she didn't have skin. And the way she got her systems back, she had to kill people. I know it's a crazy movie, but the whole point of it is that she was a bloody mess wrapped in gauze until she got that skin. Our skin is super protective. It keeps everything together and, protected underneath. So it's super important. There are structures associated with the skin. We have glands associated with the skin. We have receptors associated with the skin. And when we talk about the skin helping to regulate temperature, the skin is very vascular. Lots of blood vessels in the skin. Okay. Skeletal system, the bones, we already know how important that is, right? It's our framework. We also include cartilages and ligaments and joints when we talk about the skeletal system. The skeletal system allows us to move, right? It gives us support. It gives us our framework. It works with the muscles to allow us to move. Now, the muscles are actually what do the moving, but the skeletal system works in conjunction with that. Also, the skeletal system allows for blood production. So that's going to be important to remember. Muscular system, skeletal muscle. We talked about that. That's the muscle that's attached to the bone, allows us to have locomotion or mobility, allows us to manipulate our environment. But we also have smooth muscle and cardiac muscle for internal movement. But when we think about systems, we think about skeletal muscle. Then our nervous system, that consists of the brain and the spinal cord and all of the nerves that extend from the brain and the spinal cord. And then out in the periphery, in the skin, for example, we have receptors. We also have receptors associated with special senses. So that's a continuation of the nervous system. This is a rapid acting control system, right? It allows us to detect and respond to stimuli. The endocrine system is one that we don't think about too much until something goes wrong. The endocrine system is the hormonal system. It's made up of a number of different glands and tissues, and it is also a control system, hormonal control. And so there are a number of things that are regulated by that. Obviously, reproduction is regulated by that. Actually, a lot of things that happen with digestion are regulated with that. Our detection of light and dark, our sleep patterns, regulated by that. So the hormonal system is really important. The pituitary gland, which is the base of the brain, is the main player in the endocrine system. Cardiovascular system, we all know how important that is. We can't obviously live without that. The heart and the blood vessels. So that allows for the movement of blood throughout the body. And the blood is going to contain oxygen or respiratory gases, nutrients, hormones, right? We're moving waste, we're moving lots of things. And so the cardiovascular system obviously is important for every other system. The lymphatic system, that's another one that we don't really think about, but the lymphatic system is important. It works in conjunction with the circulatory system, and it provides immunity. So we have a number of structures like lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, a number of structures that are part of the system. And then we have cells that function in immunity, a lot of the white blood cells. And we'll talk about that by the end of the semester. And then we have the respiratory system that allows us to move air in and out for the purpose of gas exchange. So we're able to take in oxygen and put it into our blood, and at the same time get CO2 out of our blood and blow it off. That is important, right? Because we said we need oxygen for chemical reactions that allow us to produce energy. The digestive system essentially is a long, smooth muscle tube. You start at the mouth and end at the anus. And it allows for the manipulation of food material. So we take it in and we start to break that food material down into the molecules that we can use. And so we start breaking that stuff down, then we absorb it, and ultimately the cardiovascular system helps to transport it. And anything that we don't need is gotten rid of as waste. Okay. Urinary system. We think about the urinary system as, we produce urine, right? But that's not the purpose of it. That's a byproduct of it. The urinary system is a super, super, super important system. It is filtering our blood constantly, all day, every day, keeping the pH level of our blood stable, keeping the water level and all of the chemical levels in our blood stable. It is super important. And so you going into allied healthcare, you will run into patients that have kidney disease, and they might have to take dialysis, and they might be on a restricted diet or fluid intake, and they're really reluctant to always go to dialysis, or they want to drink what they want to drink, and they don't want to follow the guidelines. Super important. If your kidneys are not functioning, that's critical, because then all of your blood chemistry gets off, right? That pH is a very narrow range, 7.35 to 7.45, and our urinary system is key in helping to keep it stable. So that's super important. And then, of course, we appreciate the reproductive system. Male and female genitals are the external structures, but we have to concern ourselves with the male and female gonads, which are the egg and sperm producing structures. And that system provides a means for conception and the production of offspring. We already said that the endocrine system is one of the main regulators of the reproductive system. Okay, let's look at a couple pictures. So this picture just kind of encompasses them all at one time. So you got the brain and the spinal cord here for the nervous system. This is the thyroid gland that they're pointing to for the endocrine system. There are a number of glands. And the thing about the endocrine system that's different than every other system, the parts of the endocrine system are not in any way physically connected, right? So we got, I said, the pituitary at the base of the brain. There's also the hypothalamus in the brain, the pineal. They don't really touch. The only thing that kind of touch hypothalamus and the pituitary. We got the thyroid gland. You have the thymus gland, which is a dual kind of thing. You got the pancreas. You got a bunch of glands, and they're scattered all over the place. They don't touch each other. Like all of the blood vessels come in contact, right? Because they have their steady stream. It's like a closed system, right? The lymphatic, these are the vessels for the lymphatic. Closed system, right? Kind of. We'll talk about it when we get to 153. But endocrine system, the parts are not connected. The bones are all connected. Muscles are connected. Endocrine system not. Why? Because they release their hormones, and the hormones go right into the blood, and the blood sends the hormones wherever they need to go. So the parts of the system don't necessarily need to be connected. Skeletal system, the bone, integumentary system, the skin, the glands, receptors, hair, nails, those things fall under integumentary system. Muscular system, we're talking about skeletal muscle attached to the outside of the bones, allowing us to move. Cardiovascular, they have circulatory, that's the heart and the blood vessels. Respiratory, the lungs and the air passageways. Digestive system, that long tube from the mouth all the way down, allowing us to take in food material and break it down. Now they use the term excretory system here, and they don't even show the kidneys, they just show the bladder, but that's the urinary system, right? That it consists of two kidneys. The tubes that exit the kidneys are called the ureters that lead to the bladder, and the tube that exit is the urethra. And then the immune system, they say, this is the lymphatic system, and we got lymphatic structures, and then we have cells that play a part to provide us with defense and immunity. I don't say just the immune system, I say the lymphatic system, because this system also works in conjunction with the circulatory system or cardiovascular system. Here's another set of pictures that shows these systems individually. So in your textbook, you have something that may look like this with a caption underneath. These are the captions I want you to look at. I want you to read those. Integumentary system, cardiovascular system, lymphatic system. You see this is having a lot of vessels, and there's some structures involved in there as well. Digestive system, respiratory system. Here's my urinary system. Skeletal system, muscular system, nervous system. So you see the brain, the spinal cord, and all of these nerves. And I lump special senses in with that. So special senses is going to include hearing and vision and smell and taste. Those things are an extension of the nervous system. And then endocrine system, we see those different glands here. Here's my thyroid, thymus. The adrenal glands sit above the kidneys, pancreas, the reproductive structures, right? Those gonads, the ovaries and the testes, those egg and sperm producing structures also produce hormones. So they're included in that endocrine system as well. Okay. Another term we need to be very clear on is homeostasis. Homeostasis is your body's ability to maintain a stable internal environment even though we got stuff going on, right? We got all kind of stuff going on outside and actually inside of us. So for example, when you are driving to school or work, right, the temperature inside your car is one temperature. The temperature outside when you get out in the parking lot is another temperature. The temperature when you get in the building is another temperature. And if you're going into Delta College, when you go from one hallway to the next or one room to the next or into a bathroom, All of those rooms can be different temperatures, but your body has to stay at about 98.6, right? So even though you're exposed to these different changes in your environment, you still have the ability to maintain a stable body temperature. So sometimes you get up and you have time to eat breakfast, right? Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't eat until, lunchtime. Sometimes you might not eat until dinner. Sometimes you are eating every time you turn around. And your body still has a way to maintain a stable blood glucose level, whether you have eaten today, whether you haven't eaten today, whether you're eating throughout the day multiple times, or whether you just eat a couple of meals a day. Your body has a means to maintain a stable blood glucose level. That's homeostasis. And so homeostasis gives rise to what is called a dynamic equilibrium, meaning I have this equilibrium or I have this stability, although I got all these changes going on. Okay, no overall change. And so everything in our body allows us to do that in one way or another. But we have some specific homeostatic mechanisms that allow us to maintain homeostasis. And we're going to talk about these. And I want you to remember this because these homeostatic mechanisms you're going to talk about throughout your time in anatomy and physiology. Negative feedback is the most common. Negative doesn't mean bad, and positive doesn't mean good. They're both good as long as they're both functioning properly. They just function differently. So a negative feedback mechanism is a mechanism that turns off the original stimulus and takes us back to normal. And negative feedback, we're typically talking about something within a normal range. Like I mentioned, blood glucose, for example. If you eat something, your blood glucose will go up. Well, if you eat throughout the day, you don't want your blood glucose to keep going up and up and up and up and up, right? You want it to stay within a normal range. And the opposite is true. If I haven't eaten breakfast, right, and I don't get to eat until dinner, I don't want my blood sugar to keep dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping, right? I want my blood sugar to stay stable. So there are negative feedback mechanisms in place to keep my blood glucose stable, right? So no matter what that original stimulus is, an increase or a decrease, we want to stay within a normal range. So negative feedback allows us to do that. And we'll see a number of instances throughout anatomy and physiology where we have a negative feedback mechanism in play. Positive feedback mechanism is one in which that stimulus is increased or enhanced continually until I get a desired outcome. And then ultimately, I go back to normal. So there are a few examples of that. One of the main examples we use for that is labor for childbirth, right? So the contractions will start and they will increase and they will get more intense and increase and more intense and increase and more intense until you get the desired outcome, which is the baby out. And then ultimately you go back to normal. So neither one of them is bad or good. They're both good. They just function differently. So a negative feedback mechanism turns off the original stimulus to take us back to a normal range. Positive feedback mechanism increases that original stimulus until we get the desired outcome. And then ultimately, we will go back to normal. Remember those. Remember the difference between negative feedback and positive feedback. That's going to be important. And so here is a flow chart when, I use this flow chart all the time. I use this flow chart in all of my classes, right? It's just an easy flow chart to think about. So we use blood glucose for an example. And you don't really have to know this right now because this isn't even the system we're talking about. But I just want to fill in an example, right? So my stimulus. I just ate some cereal and milk. I didn't really, but let's just say I did. My glucose levels go up, blood glucose levels go up. There is a sensor or receptor that detects that, right? A sensor or receptor that detects that. And in this case, it's the pancreas, right? And when my glucose levels go up, I don't want them to keep going up. So my pancreas detects that change, and actually my pancreas also acts as a control to release insulin, right? And then insulin will usher that glucose into my cells and into my liver. Right? And then it's out of my bloodstream and it takes the glucose level in my bloodstream back to normal. This is an example of a negative feedback mechanism. Right? So this is what we'll commonly see. Oh, my box keeps dropping away. I don't know why. And when we do reviews, you'll have an opportunity to get in here and see what I mean. You'll be able to type on here. So this is just an example. You don't need to remember about glucose yet. That's a 153 topic, but it just is an explanation, right? It's just an example. So you have something that changes. It could be blood calcium levels. It could be blood oxygen levels. We'll end up talking about blood calcium levels in this course. So those change. They go up or they go down, right? There is a receptor or a sensor that detects that change. That receptor or sensor sends that information in to a control center. In this case, the control center is still the pancreas. There are cells, specialized cells in the pancreas that release insulin. Insulin then helps glucose get into our cells, and any excess is stored in the liver. That's our effector. The effector is then what is going to move that thing, that chemical that we need to stabilize. Okay, and so the glucose will be stored because insulin ushered it into the cells of the liver, and then we go back to our normal blood levels, right? This is an example of a negative feedback mechanism. So you will be seeing this flow chart, and when we talk about the endocrine system, you'll see it when we talk about the bones as well, and the blood. So we'll talk about this flow chart a few times through the semester. Okay. Okay. So now, let me say this about anatomy. This says standing. I don't know how that got cut off, but that says standing. Okay. Let me say this. Let me see if I do that. No, that doesn't help it. The thing about anatomy is this. I can show you where things are and I can name them. But you have to spend a lot of time going over these things to really learn them. Okay. So anatomy requires a lot of time spent reviewing. I want just to remind you that there is a room on campus, C112, where there are models that you can go in and study. I think it's open from at least from 8 to 3, Monday through Friday, at least from 8 to 3. Their hours might extend before and after, but let's just say 8 to 3 is a good window. There are models in the library for you to study. There are also models that you can check out at all of the off-campus centers. So the downtown Saginaw Center, the Midland Center, and the planetarium in Bay City. So there, if you live in those places and you want to go look at some models, they're there as well for you to check out. You need a Delta ID. Okay, so you did some homework, right, with images that look like this. And I'm not going to fill all of them in. I'm just going to do some of them. These kinds of images will be on the discussion board, and I want you to download those or open those up and practice. Okay, You won't need to know all of these. You're going to need to know some of these. Okay. I want to, let's see, get in here. Okay. So around the eye, what is that? Do you remember what that is around the eye? Okay. What about the cheek? What was that? Think back from your homework. Buccal or buccal. What about right here? Right? Remember, I told you to write terms that help you identify around the nose. That's nasal, right? Around the mouth. What is that? Right? What about the neck region? What is the neck region called? Okay. So as I'm pointing these out, I want you to think about it before I put an answer in there. What is the chest region called? Pectoral. What about under the arms, in the armpit? What was that? Axillary. This area right here between this white line, oh, you can't see my students told me that they can't see the cursor moving on a recording. You can only see it live. So between this line and this line, what is that space in between? And the label for it is right here. What is that? That's abdominal. Right. And the belly button. That's what you should have put in your notes. The belly button. What region or area is that? Umbilical. Okay. The upper part of the arm, brachial. Lower part of the arm, antebrachial. And again, you're not labeling all of these. Okay. Let's see, which one do I want to? The wrists, purple. Okay, let's see. Let's do this one. This is, get my box together. Ooh, pelvic. And then this is pubic. So pubic is really right at the area of the genitals. Pelvic is between the umbilical area and the pubic area. The fingers, that's digital. The toes are also digital. My screen keeps changing. I didn't mean to. Let's zoom back in. Let's see. The ankles are tarsal. I hope you don't hear any noise but me. Somebody is outside doing some work. It sounds like they're cutting down trees. Hopefully you won't hear it. Digital. The thigh is femoral. Okay, so the wrists are carpal, the ankles are tarsal, both the fingers and the toes are digital. I'm going to keep what I have here marked, and I'm going to add something else that they don't really have. So I'm going to put a mark right here and add that. That's inguinal. So where the torso and the leg meet, right? That's inguinal. So that could have been a little bit confusing on some of the pictures. That's inguinal. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to add on this one. We can do this one too. Patellar is related to the knee. Okay. Let's zoom back out. Okay. So those are the ones that you should be most familiar with on that view. And then from the posterior side, there are fewer that I'm going to have you. So here, cephalic means pertaining to the head. So pertaining to the head. Let's see. The whole back is dorsal. You might see that referred to in some of the textbooks as vertebral. Now, let me clear that up because actually all the backside is dorsal, but coming down this middle area here is vertebral. Okay. The middle area here at the lower back is lumbar. Let me. And then this area here would be sacral, the middle here. And then gluteal. Let's see. The back of the thigh is also femoral, so front or the back is femoral. The back of the knee is popliteal. You might hear some people pronounce it popliteal. The thing about the pronunciation of anatomical terms is that you typically pronounce things how you learn them. And then this last one I'll give is sural or the calf. You're familiar with calf. Okay. Now, one thing I didn't mention is anatomical position. Let me zoom back out. That is important, right? Standing, facing forward with the palms, also facing forward with the thumbs away from the body. This is the point of reference. Okay, so anatomical position is you are standing, palms forward, toes forward, face forward. The reason why we have to have the anatomical position is that when you are talking about a patient, it doesn't matter if that patient is sitting in a chair, if the patient is balled up in a circle, fetal position, if the patient is standing on their head. When you are referring to the anatomical structures of that individual, your reference point is always anatomical position. Okay, so anatomical position is how you're always going to think about the positioning and the placement of the structures as well as these landmarks on the body. Okay, now I want you to look at the pictures that are on the discussion board and practice this. Practice is what is going to be key in helping you do well. Okay, I want you to fill these in yourself as I go through them. I think the list is probably on your handout there, and you need to write something. Okay, so superior and inferior, and so we have arrows here: superior, inferior. Superior is toward the head, and inferior is away from the head. So obviously, when we're talking about anatomical position, the head is uh, upward, right? And away from the head would be downward. Now, some of the textbooks use cranial and caudal. I'm not sure why, because we don't really use cranial and caudal for human anatomy. You can use cranial, that's fine. Obviously, that's pertaining to the head or towards the head. But we don't use caudal because we use caudal in things that have at least 4 legs. Caudal is towards the tail. So we don't really use that. Okay. So we use superior and inferior. And then anterior and posterior. Anterior towards the front. Notice here that another term for that is ventral. Anterior is towards the front, and you can also use ventral. Posterior is towards the back, and you can also use dorsal. Anterior towards the front, posterior towards the back. Now let me back up. So let me give you some examples of how to use these terms. Let's go back to superior and inferior. If I compare the shoulder, and I'll just make a mark up here. If I compare the shoulder to the knee, the shoulder is what? Superior to the knee. If I compare the knee to the shoulder, the knee is what? Inferior, right? So that's how you use that. If I compare her eye to her nose, and I'm just using superior and inferior, the eye is superior, the nose is inferior. Okay. Anterior and posterior. Let's do some examples of that. So, his heel is what to his toes? The heel is dorsal to the toes, right? His back is what to his belly? Dorsal. His chest is what to his back? The chest is anterior, right? So that's how we use that, anterior and posterior. Then we have medial and lateral and intermediate. We don't really use intermediate too much, but medial is toward the midline. So here they've drawn in the midline here, right? And so then they put that in, and medial is toward the midline, right? And lateral is away from the midline. So when we do a comparison, now I'm just using medial and lateral here. So if I compare the eyes to the ears, the eyes are more medial. If I compare the eyes to the nose, the eyes are more lateral if I'm using medial and lateral. So it's always relative. What are you comparing, right? That's what you have to think about. So medial is toward the midline, lateral is away from the midline. Intermediate is between what's most medial and what's most lateral. Don't use that too much. Proximal and distal. I need you to take note here. Proximal and distal is used related to structures on a limb, right? So distal is furthest from the point of attachment, and proximal is closest to the point of attachment. Proximal is closest to the point of attachment. Distal is furthest from the point of attachment. Proximal is closest to the point of attachment. This is proximal. This is distal. This is proximal, closest to the point of attachment. Then we have distal, furthest from the point of attachment. So again, you use a comparison, right? The elbow is what to the shoulder? It's distal to the shoulder. But if I compare the elbow to the wrist, it's more proximal than the wrist, right? So the knee is what to the ankle? The knee is more proximal than the ankle, right? So that's how you would use that. Now, I did this earlier. If I compare the shoulder to the ankle, what term do I use there? I don't use proximal and distal here because I'm not on the same limb. This is superior and this is inferior. Okay? When I use proximal and distal, I'm comparing structures on the same limb. If I'm talking about different limbs, right, I have to use superior and inferior. The last directional term here, superficial and deep. Superficial is closest to the surface and deep is further from the surface. Superficial is closer to the surface and deep is further from the surface. Again, this is comparative, right? So the muscle is deep to the skin. But if I compare the muscle to the bone, the muscle is superficial to the bone. It's always relative. So superficial is closer to the surface, deep is further from the surface. Okay? Superior and inferior. Superior towards the head, inferior away from the head. Anterior towards the front, also called ventral. Posterior towards the back, also called dorsal. Medial towards the midline, lateral away from the midline. Proximal, closest to the point of attachment. Distal, furthest from the point of attachment. And we only use proximal and distal when we're talking about a limb. And then we have superficial and deep. Superficial is closer to the surface, and deep is further from the surface. Then we have planes. So these are ways that the body can be cut or divided, or actually even organs or structures can be cut or divided. And so then we have sagittal plane or mid-sagittal plane. Now, actually, what we have here represented on this picture is actually mid. This is a mid-sagittal plane. A mid-sagittal plane divides the body into equal right and left halves. And I need you to write this description down. The mid-sagittal plane divides the body into right and left equal halves. A sagittal plane divides the body into right and left portions. They may not be equal. Okay. So if I move this over an inch, it's no longer equal, right? It's no longer half. So it's just a sagittal plane. A mid-sagittal plane divides the body into right and left equal halves. Sagittal plane divides the body into right and left portions, not equal. Okay. Horizontal plane, also called transverse plane, divides the body into superior and inferior. There are no halves here because what's at the top is not equivalent to what's at the bottom. So there are no halves here. Horizontal plane or transverse plane divides the body into superior and inferior. Frontal plane, also called coronal plane. And let me put these other terms up here so you'll remember. Coronal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior. Okay, coronal or frontal divides the front from the back. Again, this is not even because what's on the front is not the same thing as on the back. So sagittal plane divides the body into right and left portions. Horizontal plane divides the body into superior and inferior portions. The frontal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior portions, so the front and back. Okay. Then we have body cavities. These are spaces within the body. And when I say spaces, these spaces are filled with stuff. So it's not like just an empty space just hanging out. You really don't have any empty spaces inside your body. You have spaces that are filled with stuff. So we got two main spaces. Let me change mine here. So you got the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. So remember, dorsal and ventral, dorsal more towards the front, ventral more towards the ventral more towards the front, dorsal more towards the back. Make sure you got that right. Dorsal towards the back, ventral towards the front. So here's my dorsal cavity over here. So all of this consists of dorsal cavity here. All of this looks like an orangey kind of color, peachy kind of color. Within the dorsal cavity, I have two other cavities. Within the dorsal cavity, I have the cranial cavity. Didn't mean to do that. I got the cranial cavity and I got the vertebral cavity. So those are the two cavities within the dorsal cavity. Then in the ventral cavity, that's more towards the front, and you can see it from both directions. So let me, my cursor. So all of this is ventral cavity. Okay. And I have two main cavities in the ventral cavity, thoracic and abdominal pelvic. The two main cavities in the ventral cavity are the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, the abdominal pelvic cavity is separated from the thoracic cavity by this muscle called the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the boundary between, and you can see that here. Let me get my, you can see that here. That's maybe not the best color. Let me get another color. Let me get black. You can see that here between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the diaphragm is a thin muscle that is a boundary between the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity, you see, we label abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity here because there are two specific areas, but there's no boundary between them. There is nothing that separates the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity, and that's why they use the term abdominal pelvic cavity. We appreciate the different cavities because we know that there are different things in those spaces. Okay, but the abdominal pelvic cavity is made of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, but there's no barrier between those. And then there are a number of spaces within the thoracic cavity. Okay, so you got the mediastinum. Some people use the term mediastinum. Mediastinum, the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity. I'm less concerned about you honing in on those at this point. I really want you to know the two main body cavities, which is dorsal and ventral. And then I want you to know the two cavities within those, cranial and vertebral within the dorsal cavity, and then thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity within the ventral cavity. I do want you to know that the diaphragm separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And I want you to know that the abdominal pelvic cavity and the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity are indeed separate spaces, but there's no boundary between them. Okay? Okay. I think that is everything that I needed to talk about for this first chapter. I believe that it is. So go through this, take your time if you need to rewind and watch it again or whatever you need to do. Our first exam is just over this. I'm going to make sure some pictures are posted similar to the ones that we looked at today. So I want you to go through this because our first quiz and exam are coming up on, what did I say? The quiz is on the 7th and the exam is going to be due on the 9th. So I want you to be prepared for those. We just got this one chapter. So this is an opportunity to really get a good test grade on the record book. Okay. If you have any questions, please email me, meet me during office hours so we can address anything that you need to address.